Hello, welcome to Allensaakyan's video blog. You already know who I am. I'm hosting another episode today. Thanks for tuning in across Facebook Live, across YouTube, and this will be posted later on Twitter and LinkedIn as well for other people to follow. So, what are we talking about today? As people are tuning in, we are talking about Black history. All right, why are we talking about Black history? Well, because I'm currently in DC right now, and I love it here. DC is an incredible place, full of history, United States history, and it is incredible energy here. Everything from the White House to standing where MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech, right there between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. Just the energy there is nuts. It's so great. And it's beautiful here. People are smart here. It's diverse here. It's a nice place. I like it a lot. I'm on the tail end of the 6-week trip to Dubai, Armenia, New York City, DC, and then back to SF. So it's nice to be on the tail end of this trip. You might have remembered the Facebook Live and YouTube we did from the top of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, where we were talking about kind of like the history of that. That was 20-year history, even less in terms of how long the Burj Khalifa has been around. But now we're about to talk about some 600-year history. So most people think, oh, like slavery, maybe only like 250 years or so. No. This is some 600-year craziness that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to talk about equality, and we're going to talk about empowerment, and what's really been done to bring us to where we are today. So, if you don't know yet, this museum is called the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm going to call it the Black History Museum to keep it easy for now. And they're celebrating their 1-year anniversary in DC. It's right there by the Washington Monument. It's gorgeous. 3 million people went to the museum last year. And so there's about a 3 to 4 month wait list on getting into the museum. And I was like, that's not happening. Obviously, I didn't sign up for that. So I just walked to the line of people and was like, does anyone have an extra ticket? Does anyone have an extra ticket? I'd love to go to the museum. And boom, here's the extra ticket. And then I was like, I want an extra ticket from my mom. And then I went and kept asking people for tickets. And then I went to the exit door where people were wearing these little wristbands. And I was like, are you guys coming back to the museum today? If not, can I have your wristband so I can go in and look at the museum? And they're like, sure. And they gave me a bunch of these wristbands. So it's not that hard to get in. So go, there's no excuse, go get in, ask people when they're exiting to get wristbands to go in. So, what do you do when you go in there? Well, it's organized from bottom up by history. So the lowest floor is the 1400s, and then it goes up until the top floor, which is kind of like today's athletes and musicians and pop culture figures and people that are propelling equality in Black history. So I'm going to go and talk about what I thought was most profound, and so hopefully this resonates with you guys. But what was most profound for me was the bottom. By far the most crazily societal, civilizational sort of mistakes and kind of civilizational trends and dynamics is what interests me most. And so I really enjoyed that. But the top's still good too. So let me explain kind of what happens. So when you get it to the bottom, you take this elevator that goes and shows on the side like 1980, 1960, 1900, 1800, 17, 16, 15, 14 as you go down. And you get to that bottom level, and on the bottom level, it's the 1400s. They're showing you how the area of Africa that white people from Europe went to go and enslave people. And that area was the western part of Africa. And if you go I've been recently starting to do Instagram stories more, where I drop all of my knowledge onto people, kind of like the knowledge that I'm learning throughout the day. It's like content curation. So it's just my first name, last name on Instagram, and you can go watch these stories. But so the idea is that in around 1400, Europe started going down to Western Africa to capture Africans and enslave them in order to build up the infrastructure, the economics, the everything. As you can probably think of, a human brain and human hands and human labor is worth so much in terms of getting shit done. And if you get that for free, that's absolutely crazy for people. And they're like, get as much of it as possible. So, this is actually the largest forced migration in the history of the world. I mean, there were no African Americans before this transatlantic slave trade. So, the largest forced migration in the world, 12.5 million people. 2.5, 12.5 million people. And this is literally exploiting human lives to build wealth. And so, specifically, like active years shipping people to the U.S. and to the Americas in general was, especially the Caribbean too, and Brazil and South America, was around 1500 to the late 1800s. So about that like 350-year period or so. And about 400,000 of these 12.5 million were brought to North America. There were a lot brought to Portugal, a lot brought to Great Britain, a lot brought to France and Denmark and Brazil and the Caribbean, and a little bit less brought to the U.S. But so the idea was that let's go ahead and uplift and build wealth for our countries through this. And so the crops that were being made were sugar, rice, tobacco, coffee, and they would use they would use black people to clear land, grow crops on plantations, and provide a luxurious lifestyle for white people. And this is really upsetting because when you empathize, when you really try and immerse yourself in the shoes of what it would have been like, I think about it this way: if there were black kings in Africa that went to Europe on boats and went and chained up 11-year-olds and 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and brought them back to Africa, boats full of white people that were dying from disease and all this kind of stuff from being crammed together in starvation, and then enslaved white people in Africa to build Africa's wealth, and then 600 years later, there's a white history museum located in Senegal or in Tunisia or Congo or Egypt or wherever, that it would be that'd be more like what the black people are experiencing right now. If white people can actually empathize with that. And so when it comes to thinking about like people being chained on these boats and being brought to the Americas, it's kind of a crazy thing to be stripped away from your life and not knowing anything but slavery. It's absolutely crazy. And so, and it's not like people came out of, no, don't do it, don't do it. It was literally the thing to do. It was like, we're making so much money, we're building so much wealth, and this is the best way to do it. And people just, then it started clicking generationally. Oh, they're slaves. They're less than us. Well, they're not. Every human is born equal. And so churches and governments and companies invested into slavery, and these prophets developed these new world colonies. So, for example, the selling tons and tons of enslaved Africans made people millionaires in today's wealth. Like, they would make about $62 million in a year selling about 1,000 slaves or so. I think it was 100,000. How many slaves was it? I'm gonna look it up. And mention it again later. But thousands of enslaved Africans and making millions of dollars on that. And so, Britain abolished slavery in 1833, and they ended up paying owners of slaves about $2.4 billion in today's money to buy those slaves back. So the idea is that African Americans didn't exist before now, and they gained all these new connections and new cultures and this rich African diaspora of their culture and people. So at least there's that, and this gets crazy. As you're down there, you're going into the next step, which is kind of like, okay, well, what was going on during the American Revolution? Well, actually, tens of thousands of black people that were slaves fought for the Americas in the American Revolution against Great Britain, which is crazy because you literally enslave slaves to fight for freedom. Sounds kind of crazy, and then afterward, they're still slaves. And so George Washington enlisted black people to fight for the Patriots, and this was about today's value of about like $5.5 billion in total people efforts in economics, and so having these numbers here to share. In 1790, there were about 60,000 people that were free that lived in the northern part of the United States. And then in 1860, so about 70 years later, there were 500,000 people that were free. So these free black people formed infrastructure to survive, including things like churches and conventions, and people like Richard Allen were major leaders in uplifting culture together of free African American schools and literary societies, free black press. There were blacks called Toussaints of New York, which were black entrepreneurs, and they were major philanthropists. And I found this to be crazy, that free African Americans in the North, they had to carry around freedom papers so that they wouldn't get kidnapped back to slavery. So imagine having to carry freedom papers with you so you wouldn't get captured and brought into the slave trade. It's nuts. So 1 million people were forced in the U.S. South in this domestic slave trade, and about 600,000 of them were sold. It's crazy. So yeah, so most successful slave owners sold 1,000 slaves a year at $100,000 per year profit, which is about $62 million in today's terms. So that's in 1820, about 40% of slaves that were sold were between the age of 14 and 25, so very young people. Brothers and sisters and family members were sold to different buyers, splitting up families. Everyone was making money in the U.S. This was a major business, the business. Printers and clothing and financing and insurance, and everyone that was making money that was touching slavery. And the same thing in Europe and in South America and the Caribbean. And so this ending like the transatlantic slave trade was massive. And when the U.S. did that, slave owners started trying to like breed together African Americans in the United States, and then and it's crazy because with the 3/5 compromise of the U.S. Constitution, slowly there started being a little bit of development as as black people got more seats in Congress, and the 13th Amendment. Anyway, we're going to get to that right here, but the cotton production was crazy because cotton was the most massive crop that black people were picking and everything in plantations, and so Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793 plucked all the seeds out of the cotton, and so that it went from people only being able to one person could only sift through 1 pound of cotton per day to a couple thousand pounds of cotton per day. And so then it was really important to get picking and to export that and increase the wealth of the country. So this Louisiana Purchase right after that doubled the size of the U.S. in 1803, and then boom, more cotton production. And so getting more seats and everything. So by the emancipation that happened by Lincoln in 1862, the 4 million people were emancipated. And Frederick Douglass was a big black advocate for this, major advocate. And that was the 13th Amendment that gave people the emancipation. And then the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. And so that's when the increase in Congress positions, holding office, gaining more power, increasing the climb up was happening. And there were stupid organizations like the KKK that were formed to prevent them from voting and all that kind of stuff. Um, so then the explosion of the civil rights movement happened in 1920 through 1960, and this is things like sit-ins and freedom rides and bus boycotts, white-only sections, school desegregation, Brown versus Board of Education, things like Daisy Bates, who finally started getting people to integrate Little Rock schools. Women were just killing it. They were crushing it. Women were huge advocates of succeeding with equality and black history. Women were doing an incredible job at voicing equality. And so other grassroots leadership things like talking about police brutality and marching. And so mostly black people just wanted what the Declaration said, which was that everyone should be equal. And duh, makes sense. We all want that today across the world. We've seen the join or die, where the snake's broken up into little parts of the colonies, and colonies have to come together as the U.S. in order to beat Great Britain. Same thing applies to today. You can't live North Korea and Syria and China and in the U.S. and France. You can't like have all these broken, segmented parts of civilization. You come together, and then you can have world peace and move on to the next planets and stars. And there were other really incredible movements between 1920 and 1960 that really propelled this forward. Of course, Martin Luther King, and then eventually there were still problems happening, like Emmett Till, who was kidnapped and killed. There's still problems happening, but it was definitely getting much better, and the climb was going up, and it's nuts to think about the trajectory of it happening, and everyone that had so much sacrifice in the culture in order to get to where we are today. It's nuts to think about it, and just really wanting to share it with other people, and get people to really try and empathize with it more and talk about it more, talk about race more. So let's talk a little bit about like how it's better. And so eventually over the last, like once I got out of that section, I started going up to the next couple of floors. I was able to see like, oh yeah, of course, like the jazz musicians are up there, the athletes are up there, people like Oprah and people like Tiger Woods and Muhammad Ali and Wilt Chamberlain, Kobe Bryant, other musicians like Coltrane, all these other epic people that got us to where we are today through entertainment are major roles of the last 50 years, especially of uplifting black people into the world and uplifting equality into the world. And so there were other actors, of course, like the Will Smith, and then the women in Hidden Figures was really beautiful. Cried at that movie, and just pushing this paradigm forward. There were tons of black people in the military. Thank you for your service, and so we've now we're basically at where we're at today in 2017. It's the absolute best time for anyone to be living is today. It's the most equal time for anyone to be living. And it's the best civilizational time, having conversations with people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Neil's like, when would you take a time machine back? Probably never. I mean, you wouldn't want to go back. You go back and especially black people, you would never want to go back. It's worse. Not always, because there's parts of like North Africa that were just killing it. Like women were queens, and like all this other kind of good stuff was happening too. So you could go back to certain times, but even like white people, like Chinese, Asian people, whatever, you don't want to go back. Going back it's cool to maybe be around the pyramids of Giza for a little while and that kind of stuff, but really going back is pretty much going back to when life expectancy was 30. You didn't really know when your next meal was, stuff like that. But it's cool to go back, but you definitely want to go forward. So we're in an incredible place, and we've done an incredible job, but the history is very, very dirty. It's very dirty. And it's important to talk about race. We're not really taught race in school. This is an important thing to talk about. Why is it important to talk about race in school? Well, it's important to teach about history. Like what has actually happened. Going here is an incredible way to learn about the history and to become more enlightened and enriched, and then you can share it with other people. and trying to create empathy exercises like, what if African kings were going around the world and pillaging white people and then forcing them into slavery for the last 600 years? What would your life look like today? I can tell you that my life would definitely not be the same as where it is today. I would absolutely have had way more suffering, and my family would have had way more suffering. Absolutely true. And so it's really important to share ideas like that and to get people to talk more about race and how we're moving towards equality, and how we can propel equality more in the future, get our kids to care about that more, etc. So I want to thank you all for tuning in across these different platforms. This has been a video blog post by Allensaakyan. This will be obviously on the SoundCloud page on 2030 Podcast as well. Episode 51 now, Black History. Be on YouTube, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Facebook Live. Haven't been looking at the Facebook Live comments because I'm on this facing camera. I just wanted to give the straight history. Thanks everyone for tuning in. As always, if you felt like there was something that really resonated with you, please do email me or comment below, like the post wherever it is, share it with other people, talk more about it. Let's propel this thought-provoking conversation in our communities, and then in our cities and our towns and our states and our countries, and lastly throughout the world. And let's focus on world peace, equality, and then colonizing sustainably other planets and star systems. Thank you all for tuning in. Much love.